Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth. I'm your host, Trudy Stern. Today, we're joined by someone who needs no introduction to this audience, or any other for that matter, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, a returning guest. Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Jonathan has become one of the most essential voices in understanding the modern Middle East and the threats facing Israel. Every time he's on the show, our listeners walk away smarter, clearer, and better equipped to understand what's really happening behind the headlines. The last time Jonathan was here, he helped us make sense of the unfolding dynamics of the war. Since then, things have only become more complicated, diplomatically, militarily, and politically. Now, a new development is dominating the conversation, a 20-point Gazan plan that lays out a vision for the day after. The Saudi prince arrived in Washington, D.C. yesterday and the red carpet was rolled out for him. We'd love to talk about that. We'd love to talk about what is going on with the new MOU and how that seems to be changing. So there is so much to get to. And Jonathan, we are so grateful to have you back with us. Let's dive right in. So let's start with the 20-point Gazan plan that passed the United Nations. And how does that impact anything? What does it mean for the region, for Israel, and the fact that the UN passed it?
Sure. So first of all, great to be back with you, Trudy. Let me start by saying this. The fact that the UN did this is truly remarkable in and of itself, that the UN would pass something into effectively international law that Donald Trump wrote. I feel like we're like, we're in the upside down here. We're like living in an alternative universe, right? But I think the fact remains that the countries that would have typically opposed this, the Russians, the Chinese, they're the only ones that abstained at the Security Council. They don't want to own the war. This war is dragging on. People don't want it to continue any longer. The suffering, the misery that has resulted from all of this, there's no way that the Russians were going to come out against this. There was no way the Chinese were going to come out against it. And so Donald Trump prevailed. Now, the deal itself, I mean, look, the really positive thing is that it calls for the dismantling of Hamas. It calls for an international force to come in, a security force to come into Gaza and to take over, along with a new government that would be more pragmatic and not include Hamas. All of those things are really good. The thing that I always point out about this 20-point plan, it's point number 4, and I will quote directly. Within 72 hours of Israel publicly accepting this agreement, all hostages, alive and deceased, will be returned. Right now, Trudy, there are still 3 hostages, slain hostages, that have yet to be returned. Hamas is not abiding by the letter of this deal, and we're not holding them to account. After those last 3 are hopefully returned, and we don't know where Hamas is on all of this, they're saying that they don't know where the bodies are. Let me just say, that does not strike me as true, because these hostages are among their most valued possessions. They know that this is their last remaining leverage with the West, but we need to push them. But once that happens, then we need to start to talk about dismantling Hamas, disarming Hamas. And there, people have asked me, how do we do that? Why would Hamas agree? I think the answer is, of course, Hamas won't agree. We know that Hamas doesn't want to dismantle itself, right? This is a terrorist organization that's been around since 1988. They're not interested in just simply laying down all their weapons and going quietly into the night. The leverage that we have right now is the country of Qatar. And I'm not saying they're friends of the United States, but they are right now subject to our leverage. Here's why. If you remember, on September 9th of this year, the Israelis attacked Qatar. They tried to kill a bunch of Hamas operatives that were based there. The Israelis missed, but the fact that they attacked at all was something that got the attention of the Qataris. They thought that they had just complete free reign to host Hamas, to host terrorists, to fund terrorists, and they would never be held to account. The Israelis disabused them of that notion on that day. After that, they went to Donald Trump and they said, we want a security agreement with the United States. We want protection. Donald Trump said, you want protection? You'll get it, but you got to end the war. You got to hand over Hamas. That was the deal. The Qataris have yet to end the war completely because those last three hostages have yet to be handed over and Hamas has yet to be disarmed. So if the Qataris want this security deal, they're going to have to deliver on what they agreed to. That's the leverage that we have right now heading into the implementation and the codification of this 20-point plan.
So you feel that the return of these last three hostages are pivotal, but I'm just asking you, it seems to me that all of the leadership of Hamas has been destroyed. Of course, new ones came up, and Gaza's basically leveled. So maybe is it possible that they just don't know where these three are?
Look, it's possible. It's not probable. Let me just say this. They understood that this was incredibly valuable to them. They just didn't throw away bodies. They buried them in places where they knew they could find them because it was going to be leveraged. You could get additional, Hamas operatives out of jails in Israel, that there was going to be things that they could trade for. They're going to try to drag this out as much as possible. That's what I think Hamas is trying to do. But look, I think your overall assessment is correct. Hamas is defeated. Militarily, they don't pose a real threat to Israel any longer. You don't see a lot of rockets. They can't breach the fence. These guys are, truly depleted as a military force. The number of leaders that are left in Gaza are very few. One Israeli that I talked to a couple of weeks ago told me that there are less than 5 people that they want to put on their assassination list. Now, that may be bigger now as they collected more intel, but that's a sign that, this is a spent force. And that's the good news. And I think Israel can sleep better knowing that Hamas has been depleted and defeated. But if they want to build something back in Gaza that is going to be safer and more pragmatic and less prone to war, we still need to tie up some of these loose ends.
So from Israel's perspective, does this plan really provide long-term security, or does it introduce new risks? Who's going to be overseeing this money that's going to be flowing right in?
Yeah, look, Donald Trump is the chairman of this new transitional body. So that's interesting in and of itself. He's named himself to this. And so really, I think a lot of it's just going to depend on who he taps within the U.S. system to help him oversee this if it ultimately comes to pass. But I think, when we look at the security forces, that's where I get a little nervous, because you got the Turks that want to put boots on the ground in Gaza. You got to remember, the Turks, these guys are sponsors of Hamas. They're vehemently anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. The Recep Tayyip Erdogan is an absolute thug, and we should not be giving him a seat at the table. I don't want him there. And I think it would not be smart to put him or allow the government of Turkey to have a role there in Gaza. The Qataris want a role. They should not be given one either. Also, major sponsors of Hamas, major sponsors of the Muslim Brotherhood, these two countries in general should not be given any place in the future of Gaza. So there are questions that linger about how and the way that we implement the 20-point plan. But again, I think it's important to understand that Hamas is deeply unhappy with this plan. They came out and slammed it the other day when it was passed at the United Nations. That's a good sign. Anything that Hamas is angry about, I am celebrating, and I'm thinking, good, we're on the right path.
It seems like the landscape is so complicated and almost more difficult than we ever knew. The players are more devious and malign, more connected. You have Turkey and Qatar. All of a sudden, Qatar is like a major player. They always were a major player. We just didn't really pay so much attention. It's very frightening. It seems like a whole new landscape has arisen that doesn't look much safer for Israel.
It's not. And it's funny. My colleague Cliff May always says in the Middle East, there's no permanent victories, only permanent battles. And I've been quoting him left and right because I think he's absolutely right. And in this case, even more so. Look, when you look around the region, I'll try to just explain briefly where we are. Hamas is defeated, but trying to drag out the process. Hezbollah is defeated, but they're trying to rearm. And they're rearming with the help of the Iranians, but also the Turks, which is crazy to say out loud because no one ever had that on their bingo card. In Syria, we see this new regime that's come up under Ahmad al-Shara, and he's talking about being moderate, but he's a former Al-Qaeda guy, and we're not sure if he's, really ready to bury the hatchet with Israel. So concerns there. In Iraq, where we saw a lot of rockets and missiles being fired at Israel in the early days of the war, it's been quiet, but we're hearing lately that Iran has been sending a huge amount of missiles and rockets to these Shiite militias that are loyal to the regime in Iran. So we're worried about that. The Houthis still have ballistic missile capabilities. They've stopped firing because there's a ceasefire in Gaza, but they still have the capabilities of attacking Israel. And of course, Iran is looking right now to replenish its ballistic missiles, maybe even restart its nuclear program. So all of those threats across the 7 fronts, by the way, including the West Bank, where there was an attack yesterday that killed an Israeli, where somebody drove their car, 2 Palestinians drove a car into a crowd in Gush Etzion and then started coming out and stabbing people. So the West Bank is still a front too. So 7 fronts are still all basically active, even if they're not as much of a threat as they were when the war broke out. Iran may be losing some of its strength, but then as we were just talking about Turkey, the Turks are an aspiring power in the region. They see themselves as a regional power on the ascent, and they would like to have more influence. We see them with influence in Gaza. We see them having influence in Lebanon. They have a huge amount of influence in Syria. They are essentially the new sponsors of the Syrian regime. So you look around, and they're the 2nd largest army in NATO, by the way, Trudy, the Turks are.
Wow.
They have a huge amount of weaponry and personnel that if they want to deploy it, it's very scary to think about what that might look like. And when you look at the rhetoric of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, when you look at the way that the Turks speak about Israel, the way they speak about Gaza, the way they threaten to put troops in Gaza if the war continues, all of that makes me very nervous. And then you've got the unlimited wealth of the Qataris. I mean, this is a country of 330,000 people that control 12% of the world's energy. And they have so much money that is sloshing around here in the tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that they are wielding in the United States for influence and around the region. So there's a lot to keep track of right now. It feels quiet, right? Because the guns are not, firing day in and day out. You don't hear the horrible news and, death announcements out of Gaza or Israel. That's the good news. The bad news is there's a lot of stuff simmering right under the surface.
So you're plugged into DC and onto the Hill, I think. And I wanted to just, before we move on to the next topic, ask you your opinion of whether or not our country our lawmakers and the people who are in control are cognizant of the fact that this is not isolated to Israel. Qatari now is building an army base somewhere on our land, and it is really troubling to me because death to Israel, is followed by death to America, and these are no friends of America at all or the West. So, is that very noted in all of these transactions?
I don't know how to answer that. I think people are aware of the malign influence of the Qataris. I think people are aware of the money that's sloshing around. The question is whether they're willing to do anything about it. Because a lot of the members of Congress that we're talking about here have benefited from the investments in businesses, that boost jobs in their home districts. And, the Qataris have basically bought the largest air base in the Middle East for us. And we operate out of Qatar. We don't have to pay a cent. And the Department of Defense is very happy about this. So in other words, this is a complicated thing to unravel. What we're trying to do at FTD right now, my organization, is we just want to try to collect some of the receipts. We want to be able to show exactly how they're spending their money, where they're spending their money, so that maybe we can share that with people in power and have them begin to understand the threat. In other words, it looks to me like the Qataris are trying to engage in a practice that we would describe as state capture. In other words, kind of neutralize decision makers who will be fearful of taking action to maybe void out some of these investments for fear of, losing jobs in their districts, or for fear of America having to spend more of our tax dollars. This is the sort of stuff that we need to inform American lawmakers about. We need to get them better educated so that they can make better choices. This is going to be, I think, a several years long process. If we're to be successful at all, it's going to take some time to actually inform them and to get them to think about ways that they can start to roll it back.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. And I feel a lot safer knowing that FDD is doing that. So that's great. It brings me to the next topic, hot button issue. Saudi Arabia, red carpet rolled out yesterday. Tell us about that relationship and what do you see happening here?
Well, look, the Saudis for a long time were not considered terrific friends of the United States, right? We all remember what happened on 9/11 and how I think it was like 16 out of the 19 or 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. And we looked at the way in which they were indoctrinating youth around the world, the madrasas and the schools that the Saudis were sponsoring, Wahhabism, as we called it, right? This radical interpretation of Islam was, we could attribute a lot of that to Saudi Arabia. And so they were a big problem in the war on terror. That began to change in 2003 and 2004. Saudi started to sustain attacks from Al-Qaeda, and they began to realize, you know what, with all the beating that they're taking around the world for the indoctrination, plus the attacks that they're sustaining at home, I think it was a legitimate question to ask, like, is this really worth it? And so they began to dial it all back. Today, we have a new leader in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they have the king, King Salman, who is rather old and rather ill. His son, Mohammed bin Salman, is the crown prince. He will be the next leader of Saudi Arabia. Everybody knows him as the guy that ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post writer. And this was obviously a black eye for Saudi Arabia. But I think we got to zoom out for a minute and understand that, yes, this guy is deeply flawed and he has blood on his hands, but he's also doing unbelievable things right now to bring Saudi Arabia into the 21st century. Women's rights have expanded significantly. The rights of everyday Saudis. They're trying to get themselves off of oil. They're trying to become a regular business hub that would work with Western countries with practices that are similar to ours. They want to be a tourist hub. They are trying to transform. And so the Crown Prince came to Washington looking to invest. He's invested something like $600 billion to up to $1 trillion in the American economy. The big question that I have, and I celebrate all of this, I think it's really important, warts and all. The question that I think in Israel that's being asked right now is whether the United States should be selling Saudi Arabia the F-35, our most advanced aircraft. This will have an impact on what we call in Washington QME, Israel's qualitative military edge. We have laws in the books passed 3 times. I think it was 2008, 2014, and 2020, where members of Congress affirmed that Israel should not have to do battle with any enemy that is equipped with American tech, American platforms that would threaten the edge of Israel. In other words, they had to be, we want to give them supremacy in the air, on the ground. We don't want to give Israel's adversaries any edge against them. And it's written in law. And the question is, if we sell the F-35s to the Saudis, as the Saudis are requesting, does that erode Israel's military edge? They're not an enemy, right? We know that they're talking about normalization and they're probably on the 5-yard line, but they haven't signed an agreement yet with Israel. And so are we rewarding them too soon? I think that's question number one. The other question that I think we're all asking ourselves is, how close are the Saudis to making that agreement? They should, by I think all indications, already have normalized with Israel. We know that they are working together behind the scenes. Everybody knows it, that the Saudis and Israelis are collaborating in the realm of intel and business and technology. I mean, it's happening already. Normalization is a process, not an event. I'd like to see the event, though. I'd like to see the two guys shake hands on the White House lawn with Donald Trump. I know Donald Trump wants that too, because, well, he'd like a Nobel Prize. And I got to tell you, he might earn it if these two sides finally come together and shake hands on the White House lawn.
Well, do you think that this is indicative of Iran's loss of power? Uh, I think maybe, I'm not sure, but
No, I think so, Trudy. I do. I mean, I think that the Saudis looked at what the Israelis did and they see that, Israel had total air dominance inside Iran for 12 days. And then Donald Trump comes and he drops bombs on Iran's nuclear sites. It was one heck of a statement by these two countries. And if the Saudis want to be part of this alliance, then they need to sign on the dotted line. And I think they see the rationale for doing so. If you ask me, the Saudi reticence right now stems from what they see on their TV screens as it relates to Gaza. They can't make an agreement with Israel so long as these horrible pictures still are flashing up on the screens of everyday Saudis where they're saying, gosh, we want this war to end. We don't want Israel fighting in Gaza any longer. So that's why Donald Trump's 20-point plan is so important. You implement that, you get Hamas to disarm, the war in Gaza ends. The Saudis aren't seeing this stuff on their screens any longer. The Saudi prince doesn't feel the pressure to hold off on a normalization agreement. He shakes hands with Bibi on the White House lawn. Donald Trump gets his Nobel Prize. Peace breaks out across the region. This is the really positive spin, of course. There's a lot of stuff that could go wrong, but this is, maybe best case scenario of how things could go if Donald Trump kind of puts the pedal to the metal and really forces that 20-point plan to come through, leans on the Saudis, holds off on handing over those F-35s until an agreement is signed. You could see how all these good things could come about.
wow, it seems like a movie unfolding. And what is the relationship between Saudi and Qatar?
Oh, they're rivals. And I think actually that's a really important question to ask. I mentioned that attack that the Israelis launched, and the Qataris then went out and secured a security guarantee from the United States. When the Saudis saw that, they said, wait a minute. How did these guys, these dirtbags in Qatar, how did they get that deal? They've been Hamas sponsors and Taliban sponsors and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Muslim Brotherhood. How is it that these terrible people have gotten a security guarantee from the United States and we haven't? So when MBS came to Washington, his goal was to get what the Qataris got, and maybe more so. So there's a little bit of healthy competition going on here right now, where MBS says, look, we want major non-NATO ally status, just like the Qataris have, and Trump gave it to him. We want better platforms than the Qataris have, and Donald Trump is indicating that he wants to give it to them. So I think Trump is playing off of that competition a little bit. Again, I think it's good to see the Saudis get more than the Qataris, because I think the Qataris really didn't deserve any of it. But I think we can't just keep doling out security guarantees, and we certainly can't just give out the F-35 without getting some serious things in return. And here I really am talking about normalization with Israel as probably the top thing that Trump should be asking for.
Wow. Let's see what happens. Do you see a Saudi base on our land?
I don't see a Saudi base here. I don't think they need it. I don't think they want it. The Qataris were apparently able to secure something out in Idaho, like a training base for their Air Force. But I got to tell you something. There's something very silly about this because, again, I mentioned that there's 330,000 citizens in Qatar. I don't think any of them are qualified pilots for the F-35. It's kind of a joke. They don't really have offensive capabilities. In fact, that air base that we maintain in Qatar, that's essentially their Air Force. We're there as a deterrent. They want that base occupied by the United States so that when Iran or other countries think about attacking them, we're the deterrents. And what's so interesting is that the Israelis know this, and they attacked anyway on September 9th. That's what made them so nervous afterwards, and came hat in hand begging Donald Trump for a security agreement, because they began to understand that, even with American aircraft based at the Al Udeid, what they call the Combined Air Operations Center, even with that, the Qataris were still vulnerable. And so they went begging Donald Trump for this agreement. Again, he gave it to them, but only on the condition that they hand over Hamas on a plate. They've started to do that. They need to finish the job. We need to hold them to account.
Wow. Let's see what happens and let's see what unfolds. Before we end our time together, Jonathan, I want to just ask you if you can speak about the MOU that is sorry, that is coming to an end very shortly, and that Bibi Netanyahu has stated that Israel does not necessarily want to proceed with aid from the United States to Israel. They want more of a partnership. Can you
Yeah,
speak
look,
about that?
yeah, I'm tracking this. We've been tracking this debate actually for some time. It's not new. And it's going to be fascinating, I got to tell you, because look, first of all, the Israelis just spent $98 billion on this war. They need money. They need assistance. They need help. This is a huge amount of money that they just spent, and they now have to stockpile more weapons and prepare for another round of war or multiple rounds of war. They need to rebuild the things that have been destroyed inside Israel. They're taking care of people with PTSD. The country needs assistance, and
How,
it's going to
wait,
be
but the assistance that Israel received from the United States was was only $3.8 billion, which had to be spent back in the United States. That
correct.
wasn't really assistance. It's hard to call that assistance when you
Well,
have.
no, but it offsets, right? When you have to pay for other things, if you know that you're able to buy weapons with this money, it means that it's freeing up. I mean, money's fungible, right? It frees up money for Israel to do other things. And like, there's no doubt that the vast majority of the money that comes into that 3.8 billion per year has gone back into the military. And these are things that that Israel purchases here in the United States. That is all good and it's all true. Again, though, I'm just saying that Israel's in a little bit of a tougher spot financially, economically right now. They're in a tougher spot as a result of the war. That's not a surprise to anybody. This has been 2 years of a grueling war, and wars cost money. So the idea of ending that assistance and starting something different, look, I'm not telling you that you can't do it. I think they should. And I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement here in the United States that the Israelis are developing technologies that we need, whether it's the laser system that hopefully we'll see come online soon, whether it's Iron Dome, which has been, like 95% successful in shooting down rockets, Arrow 3, which was better than our systems, our American systems, in shooting down some of those ballistic missiles coming out of Yemen and out of Iran. I mean, the trophy system that Israel puts on tanks is going to, I mean, I think it's already saved American lives. There's so much that Israel does. And then that's even before America begins to tap into the AI war that Israel just fought. Israel, I think, is the first country that has really fought this intense war. Maybe you could throw Ukraine into there too, but AI played a huge role in Israel's war. And there's a lot that the United States can glean from that. The Israelis right now are basically saying this: they don't want to find themselves at the whim of an American president or the American Congress, which is, look, let's be honest. The American Congress has started to shift radical left in a bigger way. And by the way, even some of the folks on the right have become anti-Israel. So there's concern, I think, about the makeup of Congress and whether or not Israel would get the sorts of things that it needs, even with an MOU. Right? You could still imagine Congress saying, wait a minute, we're going to withhold weapons because we don't like what's going on with Israel's war. That's exactly what Joe Biden did in 2021, or sorry, in 2024. He started to withhold weapons while Israel was in the middle of a hot war on 7 fronts. The Israelis don't want that. So what they're trying to do is, I think, starting to think about some kind of new agreement that would put Israel and the United States on a more equal footing. The question is whether that's feasible, given the fact that the United States is a superpower and the Israelis are a strong regional power, but they're not a superpower. They don't have the same economy. They don't have the same strength on the world stage. So what they are ultimately arrive at, I think it's important to start this conversation now, because I do think we need to start to unpack what the challenges were, what Israel's looking to overcome, what the United States wants out of this, especially during kind of this MAGA movement, doesn't necessarily want to spend more money on Israel. They may not, right? And so there's a lot that we need to unpack here. I think it's important that we start talking about it. I'm glad that Bibi put it out there. this is not the end of the conversation. This is the very beginning of something that's probably going to go on for another 2.5 years.
Wow. Jonathan, you've given us so much to think about. And your clarity and depth of understanding brings so much insight into these complex issues. And I know that our listeners love to hear from you and love to understand these issues better. And they do after hearing from you. So thank you so much for coming on. And thank you for unpacking these critical issues. We're so grateful to have your expertise to guide us through them. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. This has been Nothing But the Truth with Trudy. You can catch us every Thursday at 9:30 p.m. on the radio. And if you missed any part of this show or want to listen to any of our past episodes, you can find Nothing But the Truth wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.